there's this sense of, oh, my partner is not trying to make me mad by this behavior. This is just the way that they operate. And it's kind of in conflict or friction with the way that I operate. The same is true in
Mm-hmm.
the workplace, right? There's this kind of empathic emergent property as people start to learn it. Like, oh, everyone's kind of in their own lens and in their own automatic patterning, right? So like they aren't trying to create issues. Very rarely are people trying to create issues. Now, issues are created because of the friction between those. But for me, it has been huge in developing empathy.
Hey, it's Samantha Hartley of the Profitable Joyful Consulting Podcast. This season, we've been talking about gifts and talents, skills and expertise. We've also talked about tools that we can use to understand ourselves better, like the DISC assessment and personality assessments. And today, I'm specifically zooming in on the Enneagram. It's kind of hot right now. Might be in the media more than usual. I see it all the time on Instagram. And we've heard Brene Brown talk about it on her podcast, what her type is and how her sisters and how they understand it and they use it in their self-understanding and in their work. So I really wanted to know how I can understand it better, to understand myself, my personal relationships, and then how we can use this with our clients and with each other, at home and at work. I'm new to this tool, and so I'm still. You can hear in the interview, I'm still kind of really trying to understand the major principles of it. Something that was really illuminating for me that my guest is going to talk about is how we don't need to be constricted by these identities, but that they can kind of help us to understand ourselves better, and then we can work through them and get closer down to like our essence of like our essential self. I thought that was super exciting. He has tons of other great insights and stories. So I hope you enjoy this interview. And I would love to hear from you what your type is. Feel free to contact me through any of my socials and share with me your understanding of your Enneagram and how you use this in your personal life and in your work. But for now, let's meet Stephen. Stephen Van Kleeck is a systems thinker with 15 years in the technology field. He's currently leading a multi-geo team of high-performing information security engineers. His side gig is Enneagram coaching, teaching, and group facilitation, and his hobbies are largely reading and training related to those endeavors. He has 3 boys, ages 11, 9, and 5, whom you'll hear a little bit in the background of our interview. He's married to his wife, Sarah, for 14 years in May, and they have the cutest golden doodle puppy named Lily. I wish I had seen her. I missed her in this one. As I said, I think it's an intriguing conversation, and you're going to hear some great stories from his work. And He's going to do an overview of all the types. So when you hear yours, or if you don't know yours yet, I hope you'll go out and take a test and figure yours out. I use this not as a typing of like, you know, to box us in, but really a tool to kind of like understand ourselves better and understand those whom we interact with. So that is my hope as you listen to this. Like, how can I be using this in work, in understanding myself better in my personal relationships? And with that, let's get into the interview. Stephen, thank you for agreeing to talk with me about this. Can you just give us a quick background of how you got interested in the Enneagram?
Yeah, of course. So I was just running these numbers recently. I think it was 2016 was the first time I started actually looking at the Enneagram. And a lot of it was out of like trying to survive. My marriage was in a really rough spot. I realized I didn't have all the tools that I needed. And so I kind of did, it's very much in line with my Enneagram type, the type 5, the observer, started scanning the horizon for something that would help me get better perspective on what I was up to, like these automatic patterns. So I found it. I started applying it to myself for a number of years. It was super beneficial. I actually partnered it with a mindfulness practice as well, which those two dovetailed really well together. And that's part of my coaching curriculum. It's actually the 2 core pieces of my coaching curriculum. So yeah, I started really digging into it and learning a lot about myself. Then my wife took it and we started looking at the interrelational dynamics. And we're like, holy cow, there's like a lot here for us to pull out and understand about each other. Once we moved down here to Florida about, when was it, like 5 years ago now? Something like 5 or 6 years ago, we moved down here. and I started teaching classes on it as well, and just kind of doing a little intro to how it works, what the types are, what the triads look like. Really liked that. And then in 2020, when COVID hit, I wasn't teaching classes, and I thought, well, I really wanted to get into coaching, but I thought maybe it's on hold because of COVID. Turns out all the little Zoom rooms that I was in, it kept popping up, and I kept collecting clients, and I launched my coaching work in 2020. I'm still doing it now.
Amazing, amazing. So who is a good client for you? Like, why do they bring you in?
Usually it's because they're feeling stuck, right? So a lot of my clients find me online. I'm really active on. It's a really interesting place to collect clients from. So are you familiar with Reddit?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the Enneagram subreddit is a lot of people that are kind of interested in the typology and they start to understand the tool. But when it comes to applying it to themselves, like you build this awareness, like, oh man, I am totally doing all this stuff. How do I shift it? How do I grow it up? How do I mature it, right? Loosen the grip of kind of these automatic patterns. That's usually the people that reach out and say, hey, I saw you were active and you're giving good information. And I ran a little podcast season for like a year. And so they'll tune in to a podcast episode and really like what they hear, then they'll usually sign up to work with me.
Cool. So is it personal problems or challenges or trying to understand themselves or professional? Like, how does it show up?
Yeah, usually there's something acute, right? And they notice it's part of the pattern. Like I
Hmm.
can't get over, like I just keep sitting and ruminating over, me and my fiance breaking up, and I'm just stuck in the rumination. I know this is part of my personality pattern. I don't know what to do with it. So
Mm.
usually start off working on that, and then it always inevitably circles out, right, to other domains and other areas that they want to dig into and kind of expand. The whole point is we want to loosen up the over identification with the ego and the ego structures
Mm.
that the Enneagram calls out, right? And get a little more
Mhm.
freedom, a little bit more space from those automatic patterns so we can opt into how we want to respond and where we want to go.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, most of my clients come in for an acute thing. They might pick a package, but most of them I've worked with for a year or close to a year. It usually
Mhm.
drags into a lot more work once we start to unravel some of that stuff.
Sure. Well, can you take us through just like a case study of somebody that you've worked with, kind of the beginning, the acute thing that brought them in, like maybe the fiance example, and then kind of what you did with them, and then kind of like where they are now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so we'll just talk through that one. So had a client that came to me, I met in the Zoom room, had been wanting to do this work. COVID hit, had some free time, didn't want to just sit around ruminating on how much they had screwed up because their engagement fell apart. So the individual reached out to me, and we started digging into the rumination. It's really important for me for people to understand how personality forms. So we spend time right out the gate on what personality formation actually is, because oftentimes as you're digging into specifically the shadow side, a lot of people like to look at like all the cool attributes I have, but the Enneagram gets into the difficult things as well that are present. And most of us don't want to identify with that. And when we kind of choose like, okay, this is part of me too, there's a lot of shame around like, oh, like, why am I this thing? In personality, we don't select it. So I kind of walk through the process of personality formation between 0 and 6, help them understand this is very much, I call it a biological algorithm. It's very much driven by the nervous system, what feels good to it, what doesn't. And then there's behaviors and thoughts and emotional patterns that come out of that as your brain is going through this critical formation period. And then that's your strategy. It got you through childhood and you carry it forward. So you didn't pick it. That's one of the big first parts of the curriculum. You didn't pick this. This is how it actually operates. And then different types kind of have these pathways that are really useful to engage in. So for this individual, they're an Enneagram type 4, which is this individual that's really interested in the intensity of the inward emotional state, right? And this is why the rumination plays into that strategy, because you ruminate on the really heavy and intense emotions, but you also spend so much time in rumination. And like this is what the client initially wanted to understand and kind of disrupt and move forward. So for them in particular, there's this really useful embodiment kind of target, right? And the motion, the movement, the getting in the body. They actually started doing yoga on the weekends, and then this client in particular was in Northern Ireland, and it was very cold, and then would go and do a cold plunge in the sea
Mm.
afterwards. And it's just the act of like getting up, moving your body, not sitting there and letting the kind of the mind and the heart contraction drive you into the rumination. It had this great kind of disruptive, kind of a shocking the pattern kind of out of it. And he would do it on the weekends, and for the most part was pretty solid for the weeks. And then there's always homework too of making contact with what's called the centers of intelligence. Kind of a core piece of the Enneagram teaching is that there are three ways that we make sense of the world. We make sense through the body, somatically, through the heart, emotionally, and then obviously through the mind, cognitively, which we in the West tend to think is just the mind that we make sense through. And so I have a practice that brings them into contact with each of those. And then sometimes we get into very specific practices that drive you deeper into one of those if it really needs to be kind of brought into the equation more acutely. And then kind of the final piece that we really are targeting and driving towards, there's a big journaling component as well, really bringing your awareness to what's emerging and what's happening here, either through your practice or just through your day. And specifically for the four, there's this call to action of finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, because they're really seeking that intensity of the inward emotion, which is often negative emotion. It's
Mm-hmm.
what can we do externally? What can we do to notice? I have another client that found the beauty in a drive, loved to take big
Mm-hmm.
drives. They were on the West Coast, so they could have these beautiful drives with the ocean on the left hand side. And it was like, oh, like this is transcendent. There's something beautiful and transcendent in the simplicity of the drive. I'd love to use this example from a panel of fours that I often have clients watch these panels where they interview different flavors of the certain core type to get a sense for the variation even inside of a type. And one four said that the redeeming action, the motion of the body, was gardening, getting her hands in the soil, and this slow, methodical, meticulous attention to detail to grow something from a seed into something full, and then maybe to eat the fruit or vegetable that you're
Mm-hmm.
growing as well. And it may seem really like that may seem overly simplistic, but you're really stretching yourself into this other space that your pattern doesn't typically let you go into, this external motion and movement, and noticing that there's beauty and even intensity in beauty in these simple things. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a high level overview of working with that client specifically. We worked for over a year, had a massive opportunity for a big jump in career as well. That was kind of a symptom of you start to work through this and you start to free up these energies to make decisions and jump out of the automatic pattern. And so there's all kinds of really interesting, that's not unusual as we work on this one
Mm-hmm.
thing, for other big motions and movements to open up for people. And
Mm-hmm.
then they ended up moving across the world and working a really cool job someplace else. And they said they wanted to try working on it themselves, and that's kind of where we're at. So sometimes people reach back
Awesome.
out, they hit something tough, and sometimes it's, you see them off and tell them good luck. And
Mm-hmm. And they graduate. Awesome. That's
yeah,
super
yeah,
cool.
exactly.
Well, so let's back up and just do kind of definitions. What's the Enneagram?
So the Enneagram, it's a lot of things. So the Enneagram is a psycho-spiritual teaching. There's a teaching underneath it. That's the kind of the original form of it. And then there's a typology system on top of that, right? And then
Mhm.
there's a symbol that also shows kind of the motion and dynamic movement of the types. And it also shows you the most optimal places to start to stretch yourself beyond the automatic pattern of your core type. Um, yeah, that's a pretty good, I think, overview of it.
So I've heard it referred to that it was mentioned in ancient Greece, but I've also read that it was founded in like 1960. So
Yeah.
what's the story on that?
There's a ton of contention around the origins of it. There's a lot of mystery around the origins of it. Some teachers talk about this Southeast Asian group of monks that had kept the symbol, and the idea that there's different flavors that are out there. Yeah, the Pythagoras kind of origin of the numbers and the sequence. The symbol or something like the symbol shows up in lots of different places as well.
Mm,
Um, Really, you can trace back the Enneagram of personality, right? Goes back to this individual named Oscar Ichazo. And Ichazo had a bunch of what he called enneagons. So these are different ways of using the symbol. And one of them was personality. And that's kind of what everyone thinks of the Enneagram as, is the Enneagram of personality. And before Ichazo, there was this mystic named G.I. Gurdjieff. and he had a school he called the Fourth Way, and that's kind of he really collected a lot of information and kind of laid the groundwork. And then guys like Echazo kind of took it into their school and fleshed out the personality side. And then another teacher named Claudio Naranjo took it and further developed it, the psychological components. He was a psychologist. And then it's kind of been evolving and going through permutations and getting expanded since then by different teachers who have taken the core of it and maybe augmented it or drilled deeper into different sections of it.
Cool. So I first heard about it in, I guess, the early 2000s, and when I heard about it, I saw kind of like the names of each of the types, and I saw there was a type called an achiever. And when I took the test, I didn't come up as an achiever, and so I was like, "Well, this is nonsense." And then I
Mm-hmm.
threw it out for 20 years, and then a friend reintroduced us to it and like talked about it all the time. And I was like,
Yep.
all right, I'm going to go try this again. Um, and I still kind of felt like whatever. And then he had a book, and the book talked about the thing that you're saying is the formation of the personality. And so like there was a little paragraph at the start of each explanation of the types, and all of us in my friend group who read it were like, that was like my biography right there. Like, how could it be so specific that they would like know exactly what happened? So um, then I have come up as a 3. So I'm probably a 3 with a 4 wing or a 4 with a 3 wing. But I really feel like in the biography of the formation, like that's my story in there. So I'm a 3. My husband's a 4. Our friends here are 1, 1, and 9. My friend who reintroduced me to it is a 7. So I'm starting to understand this. Also, Brene Brown is super into it, and I've heard her talk about it on her podcast with her sisters, and so it's like it's really up. Um, so I wondered if you could do. Can you just do a quick run through of the 9 types and like a 1 or 2 liner about each one?
Yeah, sure. So we'll start. So there's three different triads, right?
Hmm.
We'll start with what's called the gut triad. These types revolve around anger, right? So it's the eight, the nine, and the one. The eight is the externalized anger. Like I'm big, it's here, you deal with it kind of anger, right? It's called the challenger. The type 8 is often called the challenger. Motion oriented, movement oriented. There's different levels of health, so I had to pick a snapshot somewhere like in the middle because they all these types can operate very differently depending on where they're at with the levels of health. There's instinctual stackings, and then the wings also, the types next to that type, if there's a dominant wing, will also color it. So just to be clear, I'm really taking a cross section and a snapshot to try to get a sense for it. Yeah, so the eight's very okay with the anger, feels it, moves around, can kind of suck the air out of a room, often arrive in leadership positions because of how they can move and orient people. I always joke they can make it to the top, but there's usually a trail of bodies if they haven't really figured out how to open up the contraction of the personality formation. Right next to the 8 to the 9, this is the peacemaker. The peacemaker is actually in denial of the anger and spends a lot of
Mm,
energy trying to uh, craft a reality where they're fine with everything outside and they're fine with everything inside, even if they're not. Right.
mm,
So there's
mhm.
a lot of pseudo peace. Is what the language that often teachers use that's being kind of crafted and created. Now, as they start to access their anger, things can start to open up and realize that anger is not a negative thing. It's okay to take up space. It's okay to have an opinion. It's okay to inject yourself into processes. Then they take this ability to really understand everyone's perspective, which is needed to create the pseudo peace. Well, I get why you hurt me, so it's fine, right? Then they become awesome mediators. They can be great leaders. So that's the 9 in a snapshot. The one is the internalized anger, right? So the one is really trying to. There's this. If you're familiar with the super ego, the ego and super ego, it's the super ego like in the driver's seat, wants to do everything right, really interested in whatever the value set is. I've got to follow the value set. I've got to make sure it's done properly. So they hold themselves to this crazy high standard, and there's often anger around the fact that the people around them aren't, right? So there's this
Yeah,
judging,
yeah.
critical quality to them, and they use that anger to kind of fuel this motion and this movement in the world. As they start to first off be okay with their anger, because they also hate that they're angry about things. So there's this looping kind of thing going on. They really care about doing the right thing. They're often activists, right? They really care about justice, right? So there's all kinds of beautiful qualities as they start to open up that they can tap and use even as they're realizing I'm not this. Like this is a
Mm,
piece of me, but it's not all of me. That's true for all the types. We start to get some space from the personality. Doesn't mean we don't have these qualities. It means that there's a deeper thing that we're actually moving from. The next triad is the heart triad. So the two is heart centered. These are all shame oriented types. They revolve around shame. The two is this externalized heart, right? So they're the helper, they're the supporter. They're trying to come out, and they often have this really acute awareness when they step into a space of what people need, right? So there's
mm,
a pride component of I know what you need and I can give it to you, right? They often are
mm,
neglecting their own needs, aren't connected with their own needs, and that can lead to burnout and all kinds of challenges and issues. They keep lists whether they like it or not, and when things get lopsided, they start to get a little bitter about how much they've supported and haven't been supported, even if no one asked them to help
mm.
with anything, because they're kind of compulsively doing it, right?
Yeah.
And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of pieces that can open up as the two stops leaning in and kind of forcing their help and waits for an invitation to help because they're so good at it, right?
Mm,
It's just that they're doing it in compulsion instead of again finding that space that they need and then accessing it as they need, and then getting in deeper contact with their own needs and being able to ask for help, kind of putting the pride aside that they can help everyone but they don't need any help, and receiving and getting
mm,
restored as well. The next is the three, the achiever, right? The
mm-hmm.
three is kind of detached from their shame, just like the nine is kind of detached from the anger, and but they are in this process of achieving, right, to fill that void. Like I am valuable because I achieve and I do things, and that's this powerful energy that they have so much energy to go and knock things out and achieve things, but they're still trying to like, kind of stave off this sense that they aren't of value, right? And again, you can see how this forms in little kids when they do something great and they get pats on the head and it's like, oh, this is dopamine, feels good, I need to keep doing things,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the three largely just needs to come into contact with their intrinsic value, that they aren't what they're doing. It's great that you can do stuff, it's just not where your value actually comes from, right? And then you can
Mm-hmm.
achieve what you want, and if you fail, it's not a value statement on yourself, right? If something doesn't work out, you kind of are standing on your own 2 feet with the intrinsic value in place. The next one's the four. The four is this internalized heart. They have this unique sense that they're broken often, and they kind of cultivate a lens to kind of see themselves in the world. And there's almost a sense of comfort in the brokenness, or in, you might say, there's a sense that I am unique because of my brokenness. And so the two really comes into contact with the fact that they're human like the rest of us, right? As they realize that they aren't uniquely broken anyway, even if there is brokenness there, right? And there's this opening, like I talked about with my story with the four, when you open into the motion and movement, right? Then you can start to free yourself up from the constant ruminating around the brokenness, right? That's there. And you can start to find the beauty in the world around you. They have this really deep poetic, artistic orientation towards the world, and a lot of some of the best artists were fours. And they're able to see the beauty and hold the pain simultaneously without a lot of tension, which is
Mm,
very unique for a lot of people. So they have of really interesting perspectives to offer the world if they can unlock that pattern, right, and open up from that pattern. And then the last triad we'll go over is, this is the thinking triad, right? So this is people oriented
mm,
towards the mind. The five is the internalized thinking process, and all these types are oriented around fear, one way or the other. So the
mm,
five is feels sort of has this sense of not being safe, in the way that they have secured a sense of safety is through this observing function. So I stay out of the fray, but I observe it and I can understand how things operate. Then maybe I'll feel safe enough to actually engage, right? So there's kind of been this link between data collecting and safety that happens for the five at a really young age. And so the growth edge for the five is the engagement, realizing they can engage, realizing it's safe to come in, to kind of decompartmentalize. There's a lot of compartmentalizing and labeling that you do when you're stepped away from it, but it's okay to step into the experience of life and trust that when it's time to sort things out cognitively, you'll have the capacity to do that instead of kind of needing to stay at the perimeter as much. Um, Next to the five is the type six. This one's called the loyalist. So the six is again disconnected from the head center, like the other types in the middle of the triads have been for their respective domains. They don't believe that they can sort things out themselves. They have a they just don't trust their thinking center. And so they're looking for authorities outside of themselves, ideological frameworks or people, groups that they can kind of
mm,
outsource their inner authority to. And this is because the
Mm,
world's a scary place. They don't know if they can. It's kind of things are shaky, generally speaking, shaky. And so for the six coming into contact with their own authority, their ability to sort through things and figure things out themselves. Not that it's an issue to be part of a group. Just don't outsource your authority to the group, right? And
mhm,
all that
mhm,
takes courage. Courage is kind of the growth edge. Like I'm going to step in. I don't know for sure, but I can step forward anyway. It's not the erosion of the fear, right? It's cultivating courage, which can only actually happen through fear, right? It's a emergent property of being scared is the courage and moving forward anyways.
mhm,
And sixes are great. Sometimes they're called the soldier. They're super dutiful. They want to do things right. They're super loyal. So as they decontract the fear and get more freedom and touch their own authority, they're awesome team members. They can be really solid leaders. Really, there's a lot of people on my team that are sixes when they take the Enneagram.
mhm,
My 9 to 5, and they're fantastic people. But there is a lot of work of helping them pull that courage up and trust that they can actually figure these things out themselves. And then the last type is for this walkthrough is the seven. The seven's the enthusiast, and it's the externalized mind. So the seven is staving off this kind of sense of fear by staying active and moving into like stimulating activities. Usually it's fun stuff or like intense things, right? And often when they're in the thing they plan, they're thinking about the next thing that's going to be planning, and they're kind of like bouncing
mhm,
from thing to thing. So there's a lack of presence there, and the fear is if I just slow down and get introspective, then I'd have to deal with all the stuff that's actually under here. So it's the mind is used to keep
mm,
in motion and keep things moving. They're often really good at multiple things. They're experts in lots of different areas. They pick things up super, super quick. So you might see them do big career shifts throughout their life, and they kill every single one of them
mhm,
because they're just so adept at
mhm,
picking new things up. But again, it's this compulsion to kind of stay moving. And so the seven really comes into
mm,
contact with what we call sobriety. It's not necessarily about exogenous substances. It's kind of like bringing like slowing things down and not needing consistent stimulus. Slow it down and you can
mm,
come into contact with the difficult things, and you're going to survive if things aren't always fun or exciting, right?
mm,
And then
mhm.
they can use that super adaptable mind, freely instead of being stuck in the compulsion of persistent movement. So that's a quick run through.
Awesome, super helpful.
Okay.
I'm listening for everybody I know is one of these. I'm kind of listening for identifying them, and then there's a couple of them I don't have somebody, and I feel like I'm gonna have to come back to them. I don't know any of those six soldiers yet, but
Interesting.
I need to figure out who I know who is that. Um, we uh, we can sometimes hear your children. You have three boys,
I do,
and
yeah.
before you and I were talking about, so they're 11.
Yep.
How old?
I have an 11-year old, a 9-year old, and a soon to be 6-year old, all boys. Yes.
Uh-huh. So, how intentional can you be about forming which one of these types they're going to be? You know what I mean? Or is it just like no matter what you do, they're gonna have
Yeah.
the experience they're gonna have. They will have the shame experience, they will have the anger experience, they will have the fear experience, no matter what you do. Or can you be like, I really want to help them to find their intrinsic value, or I really want them to trust themselves, or I really want them to slow down and be with themselves.
Yeah. That's a great question. This is one that I tackle in my class because inevitably I have parents that come to classes, right? And we start talking about how these strategies form as like a defense against reality. Like there's something uncomfortable and there's a way that feels a little safer to navigate. And this is the personality formation. And so all the parents think, oh no, like I'm part of this. I'm part of my kid not feeling safe. And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, like that is the reality of it, right? Like
Right.
your holding environment is a big piece, right? And how you're interacting with it and figuring out how to navigate is a big piece of it. Now, there's also this nature piece, right? That it's genetic of some sort because there's different kind of somatic proclivities, like nervous systems, like think the type 8, right? This challenger type in those formative years, there was something about like the challenge, the intensity that it liked. Whereas there might be a type, like potentially like
Mhm.
a type 2, this helper, that would shrink away from that kind of like coming into contact and having like an oppositional kind of contact, would shrink away and not want that strategy. And there's a big piece of that. That's why was the nervous system wired one way versus the other. It's something to do, some kind of genetic component. And then there's the bouncing off the environment, which is, the family of origin. So
Mhm.
personality is going to form no matter what. You can't get around. You're not going to have a personalityless child. what you can do, what I believe you can do, is have them less entrenched in it or more entrenched in it, right? So the levels of development are literally mapped out from the most healthy level is you're actually at the personality structure has the loosest grip on you, and you're
Mm,
moving more from this deeper place. What a lot of teachers and authors call essence. You're moving more from your essence and less from the pattern of the structure of the personality, right?
mm,
As you move into the average level, you start to get a little bit more contracted. As you move into unhealthy, you become super contracted. And it has
mm,
to do with those three centers I talked to, how liberated they are to do what they're supposed to do, or how contracted they are to the
mm,
game of the personality structure. And I do think really conscious parenting can ensure that it's less contracted, less constricted. They're still going to have a personality they're going to emerge through. It's the context we all emerge through, but it doesn't have to
mhm,
be super pathological and super entrenched and really difficult. We can help them be in a more liberated state and understand that they aren't just the personality structure with good parenting. It's very hard to do. It requires a lot of energy, but
yeah.
it's worth it. Me and my wife are really dedicated to paying attention to the personality, getting into the experience of the child, and really trying to understand where they're coming from. And then when we screw things up, we're modeling how to come back, talk about what we did wrong, talk about what we need different from them, right, and have that
Mhm,
dialogue as well.
mhm. Well, it's interesting because I had shared with you before that when I read the book, I feel like a lot of it is true, but for me many years ago, before I did a bunch of personal development work. And so I think the things that you're talking about like not being trapped in those patterns are what I feel is kind of the distance between what the book is describing for a classic three and where I am now. So I do think there's been enough evolution. Now, having said that, there are a lot of the kind of the descriptors that they'll say, well, I'm like, well, that's just true and right. It's important to achieve or it's important to be productive. Like I feel the way in which I'm like, yeah, in ways that are pretty definitive still. And so I can feel the kind of the accuracy of that typing and the ways in which I'm some of the things that are supposed to really get a three down. I don't have so much of that anymore. So I do feel like there's the personal development work can. What I like that you were describing is that I'm not so tied to that pattern, or there's more expansiveness
Yep.
in my self understanding.
Yeah, and there's also another kind of layer to it. So if you look at the Enneagram symbol itself, there are lines, right? There's these internal lines from your type to other types. And actually what happens is those you actually have access to those other energies in different ways, right? So
Hmm.
also as we kind of free things up from our core type, we also are accessing the higher side of the energies that we're connected to as well. So there's a very real like diagrammatic kind of expansion that's possible as you start to realize like I'm more than just this patterning, and there's other energies at play that I have access to as well. And so there's an expansion of the experience of the qualities that you notice are more present or less present depending on positive or negative qualities as well.
So how are you uh, using this? What I understand is the individual typing. What I don't yet understand is like what to do with it, like put it into action.
Mhm.
So how are you being in your work relationships, and when you're coaching people, how are you instructing them to kind of behave in relation to the other types?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I feel like this is where the big gap is in like what I call the internet age of the Enneagram. I always talk about taking it off the page and bringing it into your life,
Yeah.
from the coaching perspective. And so the way that I use it on my coaching is the Enneagram, I call it a targeting system. It really like surgically gets into our contractions, the kind of the dynamic motion and movement. One of those inner lines I was talking about, when we're stressed, we actually go to the low side of that type and we kind of pull those energies in and it mixes with the core type. So understanding, oh, when I'm stressed out, it looks like this. Like I can kind of back my way in if I don't have a lot of awareness of stress arising in me. I can have external indicators that say, oh, this is stress, right? Which is literally my story. I didn't know
Hmm.
I was stressed when I realized I got the low side of the type 7, which is the enthusiast, but the low side of the 7 is very scattered. So when I'm I would find myself stressed and wandering around, literally wandering around my house from room to room, thinking, what am I doing? What am I doing in this space? I was
Mm-hmm.
able to use the targeting system of the Enneagram to say, oh, this is that scattered state that I step into when I'm stressed. Let me do a check in here. Like, what am I stressed about? Because it's not hitting my awareness. So the
Mm-hmm.
Enneagram's great for noticing like the different qualities, or when I'm more liberated, when I'm more constricted, right? What are the qualities of it? When is my
Mm-hmm.
fear running or not running? And, when essentially different flavors of the pattern that are running. It's like a great targeting system for that. And then what I do is I also teach people mindfulness. So I teach people how to come into contact with themselves, to slow down, to notice the different centers where you're connected and disconnected from it, right? And so what happens is as we start to cultivate an awareness that the pattern's running, usually it starts with journaling at the end of the day, or I remember, oh, last week I was totally stuck in that, or earlier today I was. And as your awareness grows, the time frame between the pattern emerging and you noticing it starts to shrink, right? And it takes
Mm-hmm.
practice. There's a discipline component to this. And you start to notice in the moment that you're doing the automatic pattern thing. And there's something really cool that happens. A lot of people think that if once I see it, it's like there's 10% seeing it and 90% is grueling activity of shifting and really brute forcing and changing it. I found the inverse of that to be true. The awareness of it already is starting to open it up. So you're getting space from the pattern just by the act of noticing it and noticing it sooner and sooner as it emerges. Now, it doesn't mean you're aware, there's nothing left to do once you have awareness. And what I notice is there's a really kind of frustrating phase in this work where you're noticing the pattern, it's emerging, and you're realizing why you pick the automatic pattern because you want to eject out, and it's like, oh, but I kind of want this. I kind of like this, right? And that can be
Yeah.
really frustrating because you want to be liberated from the pattern, but as you start to get the option to, you start to notice like, oh, this is doing something for me. Like I'm picking
Mm-hmm.
this for a very specific reason, and it wasn't all bad, you know. And then over time, as you continue to practice the, all right, I'm doing this thing again. I'll use an example of a client and a friend of mine now who's a type 9, and the type 9 again is disconnected from the anger, doesn't kind of feels like they're a waste of oxygen, they aren't allowed to take up space. um, and when we were coming into contact with that anger, she was noticing at work where she was stepping back instead of saying that process sucks and I think we could do it better. She was shrinking back, and we started talking
Mm-hmm.
about sessions. Well, what would it be like if you spoke up? What's the fear? And so what I have people do as they're really shocking these patterns up is push into it anyway, courage, right? Push into it anyway. And then I want you as soon as you can to journal what happened, right? Because we write these stories that if I disrupt this pattern, everything's going to fall apart because the pattern and the ego's telling you that, like, this is why we've stayed alive, is these
Yeah.
strategies, right? And then you
Yeah.
push into a new kind of a behavior. And what almost always happens is all this positive stuff unfolds. For her, she raised her hand and said, I actually think the process sucks. I know that I could fix it. Will you give me a chance to? There was a little bit of pushback. She stood her ground. She got an opportunity to fix the process, right? And then got all this great experience and eventually ended up going to a whole different place, getting a big pay bump, right? But it was because she was able to practice being in conflict and being uncomfortable, which is something the pattern does not
Mm.
want to do. And when
Yeah,
she
right.
brought her awareness into the challenge of it and said, wait, there's good stuff in here though. It was uncomfortable, but my boss respects me more and I get to fix a process. I get to show a skill set that I wouldn't be able to showcase otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
right? That starts to let the ego say, oh, well, maybe we can loosen up a bit, right? Maybe we can open
Yeah.
this up a bit and not be so rigid around it. And that's creating some space from that pattern, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's the awareness piece and then there's the action piece, right?
Yeah.
And there's kind of a building the awareness. Once you have it, then there's tension around taking the action. Then as you take the action, really noticing that the world didn't fall apart. Everything didn't come crashing down when you start to select a new kind of a behavior. And then
Mm.
you're really starting to cultivate some new neural pathways, right? Some new somatic ways of operating, new emotional states as well that you haven't ever been in before. And that's the technical definition for expansion, right? New
Yeah.
things, new
Yeah.
experiences, new opportunities.
And that's amazing and so exciting. I'm very growth oriented, and so I'm like, it's totally worth it to go into those growth edges and do those things. But I think it begins with awareness, and awareness is really the first step and the hardest step. And then the second step is as you're saying, it's like then taking action on that, and that can be that's the opportunity to break a pattern. But I feel like, but it's going to be so good on the other side, so just do it. So. Um, it comes down to the values, I think, that drive each of these. So back to the work setting, you had
Hmm.
talked about how you as a manager work with your team with Enneagram, and
Yeah.
also I'm wondering how you like manage up and
Hmm.
work organizational politics and things like that, knowing this information. So how do you feel like that gives you an advantage or helps you to be more effective in your work?
Yeah. First, I want to give a caveat slash disclaimer here because um, there's a lot of people that are like trying to armchair type people and they think they have the type right and then they change their behavior towards them because they've typed it right. And I just want to give a warning that I've been doing this for the better part of a decade. And sometimes my first reaction to someone's type is wrong. And just
Mm,
looking at behaviors doesn't necessarily tell you the deeper motivations right underneath. So even if you suspect you know someone's type, still enter the dialogue, put your assumptions on the table, right? I leave them in the backdrop, but I don't skip conversations and getting to know people based on what I think their type is. And I
mm,
just want to throw that out because as the Enneagram gets popular, which you've noticed, there's a
yeah,
lot of people that are going around typing everybody
yeah.
and probably not right. And they're making a lot of assumptions. And I'm noticing this new, sort of a new way to be biased is
Yeah,
emerging through
yeah,
these type
yeah.
through the typology. And I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. So don't skip the conversations because you suspect the type. Have it anyway. Get to know people. Be transparent. Have the real talk if that's what's needed to really get to the heart of something. All right, now that that's out of the way. So for my team, I have had them take it. It's always optional. It's just something I think could be useful for us to do. My team right now is mixed. Some people have taken it, some haven't because we've had turnover and brought new people in and everything. Um, what's really useful for in the professional setting when someone chooses to engage in it is it gives us a shared language, right? So they start to read reviews of type six because have had a decent number of type six, which is really interesting because I'm an information security professional, right? And the six is very interested in security, broadly speaking. So I always find that almost like poetic in
Yeah,
some ways.
sure.
Um, so with the six in particular, right? I know there's a distrust for their own ability to sort through things. They're reading that, they're noticing it, right? So one real world example is, I'm coaching up one of my individuals. I really want them to drive more initiatives, to corral more teams, to be able to influence, right? We have the backdrop of the type six that he knows, I know, we're talking about it. um, I listen to a presentation. I'm a fly on the wall as there's a pitch, and I'm noticing that as the solution's being pitched, there's also holes being poked in it in real time. And so this is a huge opportunity for coaching on the back end. Hey, remember what it says here about you not trusting your ability to move forward. You're hedging the solution as you're pitching it, which doesn't cultivate a lot of trust in what we're trying to
Right.
do, right? Did you notice that? I did. Okay, how can I support you in noticing it more? And then what's the hang up for just pitching a solution confidently, right? And trusting that if there are issues down the road, we'll be able to sort them out in real time, right? And so it really is a shared language we get to use and just an extra kind of substrate to lean into for those coaching
Hmm.
conversations. And now I'll have conversations with the same individual and hey, this is a type six thing. I know it is. I just want to get your take on it, right? So in the one-on-one,
Hmm.
they're bringing it forward. We have a shared language that we can work with, and it's just like an augmentation to what I'd already be doing with coaching in the professional environment that helps
Hmm.
us get a little bit deeper and have a little bit more like detailed technical kind of vernacular to share and to talk about. So it's super
That's
useful in
great.
that way. Yeah.
And as a five, what do you explain to them about you and how to work better with you?
Generally speaking, I'm very data driven, right? And so I'm really like I raise that with them. So I don't care if you disagree with the decision, but bring me the data that shows me that your idea is better, right? And then I
Hmm.
showcase it and I draw their attention to it. Hey, I thought this was
Hmm.
going to be better. This person came and showed me all this. We should totally be doing it this way. And so
Hmm.
they understand what my kind of language of access is, and they
Hmm.
understand that I'm not my ego's not in the way. I don't need to be right. I don't need the
Hmm.
optics of being right. And that's really important for me for them to understand about me because I really I want everybody free to bring their best forward, even if it's in conflict with what I'm doing or another leader's vision. And I want them to know that the language of influence here is data. So show me it.
Mhm.
Let's have that conversation, right? That's show me the evidence for what you're talking about. And then let's see if there is a course correction here, or there's some way that we want to bring you in because you've got something that we need, right, for a project.
Mhm. And when you're managing up, I know what it has been like for me in corporate settings to be like, well, there's this person and their personality. Politics to me is not, it's all about personalities and not about work. And so it was like, how do I get something past this person who has this kind of quirkiness and this quirkiness and stuff like that?
Yep.
Um, and so how does that, I mean, I'm not sure if all of those people that you're reporting to have, taken the diagnostic on themselves. And so you're probably making assumptions about who they are. But how are you leveraging that in your work?
So you're right that they haven't taken it. And so what I usually try to do is I table the suspected core type typically, and I will have conversations where I'm pulling information and noticing things. Right when I'm in dialogue with them,
Mhm.
noticing the language that they use, noticing the way that they treat people around them, right? So this
Mhm.
is one of the things about the five that can unnerve people if they pick up on it is we're constantly collecting information. It's not even necessarily a conscious thing. Like I have to consciously table it sometimes so that I'm not making assumptions like I was talking about earlier.
Mhm.
I'm coming to
Mhm.
it fresh, even though that information might augment, right, how I move forward as things become more clear. So I'll tell you a
Mhm.
story about how the Enneagram has been useful for me. So I had a leader that I strongly suspected was a type 8, the challenger. And I suspect I'm right about that.
Mhm.
And so this leader was, they're, eights are often very big and they can intimidate a lot of other types. So
Mhm.
there was this kind of like gas and brakes thing happening where we'd get on these big town hall calls and then he'd want people to speak up and talk about what questions they had, or you have concerns about the vision and where we're going. But people were scared to speak up because of how big and how direct. So sometimes a question will be
Mhm.
asked is like, well, I thought I answered that last week, but I guess I didn't, right?
Mhm.
Oh, I shouldn't
Yeah.
even open my mouth. Now I look dumb in front of everybody. The
Mhm.
eight isn't thinking that way, right?
Mhm.
They're so instinctually driven that often they
Mhm.
have to engage the mind more so that they can parse
Mhm.
things a little bit better in real time. But they're very just kind of just this is me, I'm big, I'm this, right? And everyone just kind of has to deal with it. Obviously, until they start to cultivate more awareness and unlock a bit of that structure. So I started speaking up more on those calls, right? But I was speaking up specifically with this assumption that this is probably an 8, right? And they're
Mhm.
asking for people. That also wasn't a big assumption. They're literally asking for feedback. And my feedback was everybody's not comfortable. Like we have really smart people on this call and everybody's not comfortable sharing. So let's open up other avenues for feedback and see what we get. Maybe even anonymously. Oh, great idea.
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah,
So I'm
that went down okay?
yeah, oh yeah, yeah. I mean, because there was a very sincere desire for feedback from the team,
Mm.
right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But it was being presented in this energetic way that was shutting
Yeah.
down feedback, right? So
Yeah, so kind of
people were kind of
appearing
confused.
terrifying.
Yes, right. And what happened through that, because I was willing to speak up like that, this is also how you get a type eight's attention and how you get their respect. When you don't shrink back, they feel like, oh, this
Mhm.
is a peer or an equal that actually can hang in the relationship. Now, that's not to say there's not work to do on their part to not freak people out, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I, knowing that, was able to step into this kind of managing up relationship. And I got multiple calls around soft skill stuff from this same leader asking,
Mm.
have you heard other people complaining about this? Because they won't come to me. Right. And I kind of
Mm.
became this like trusted advisor in the scenario by understanding enough of the personality structure to know what respect would look like and to kind of feed in some alternative ways of soliciting feedback. Right.
Great,
That
great,
wouldn't
great.
freak people out. And that's just a
Mhm.
wider understanding of personality typology. I didn't know everyone's type. I didn't need to know we have a pretty
Right.
big distribution. Everyone wasn't going to be forthcoming with information based on how he was kind of trying to get it in a way that just
Yeah.
wasn't receptive. They weren't receptive to. Yeah.
But you still have to be brave enough to be the one who does speak up and say people don't feel safe to do this. So that's
Yes.
also amazing, and a great way to advocate for the others that are
Yes.
out there saying like, I'm never going to do this.
You know,
uh,
that's one of the big benefits of the Enneagram. When I teach the class to people, I hear this feedback all the time. I don't really need to like pitch it to anybody, but as we get towards the end and everyone's kind of mapped themselves and seen me walk the whole Enneagram around, there's this sense of, oh, my partner's not trying to make me mad by this behavior. This is just the way that they operate. And it's kind of in conflict or friction with the way that I operate. The same is true in the
Hmm.
workplace, right? There's this kind of empathic emergent property as people start to learn it. Like, oh, everyone's kind of in their own lens and in their own automatic patterning, right? So like they aren't trying to create issues. Very rarely are people trying to create issues. Now, issues are created because of the friction between those. But there's, for me, it has been huge in developing empathy. Like these people won't
Hmm.
speak up for themselves. So that empathy is a great engine for speaking up for them for me, you know? And so
Yeah.
I think that's just a knock on effect, generally speaking, with the tool as people learn the different flavors of these patterns.
It's yeah, valuing the differences. It was my experience with the Myers-Briggs when I first took it. I was like, oh, now I understand why I can't have a conversation with that guy because we're just opposites, and no wonder we didn't have a kind of a common language. Um,
Yeah.
so it's been super helpful, and I'm still so in the early stages of understanding it, and I'm still probably all in the doing the personal stuff with it, but I would love to bring it into work and
Yeah.
be able to understand it more. So this has been super super illuminating. If someone wants to find out more about you and how to work with you on this, what's a good place for them to go?
Yeah, they can go to my website, mindfulenneagram.coach, and my contact form's there. It comes through my email. My email is just mindfulenneagram@gmail.com is tied to that. Yeah, I do one-on-one coaching. I can do one-offs where we just do typing if you're just interested in your type. We can do a coaching package where we can work through a very specific issue, like the ones I shared on this. And then I teach classes too. I've taken a break from teaching classes for a while, and I've gotten the itch again. So if people
Mhm.
are interested in classes, I'm based down here in Florida. So if you're local, we could, I could sync up with you, or we could do something remote or over Zoom.
Fabulous, fabulous. Well, we will put all of that in the show notes, so it will be easy for our listeners to track you down. And it's been just super. I mean, I could keep talking about it for hours because I'm really interested in it, um, and uh, and just the many, many applications: personal, family, work, world. The whole thing. So,
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
just so good. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Yeah, of course. No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'd appreciate if you'd like this episode, and if you enjoyed the show, why not subscribe? Be sure to click the bell to get notified when new episodes drop.